Well, we got all our garlic harvested this morning, and we're calling this episode Living Close to the Land. So, our ancestors had to live off the land, they had no option. We have a few options open to us, but right now the garden's producing beans, as you can see Kathy picking, our garlic, we've got new potatoes, we've got beets, onions, soon to have carrots and parsnip and cabbage. So yeah, the last of our venison, the last of our venison was cooked up last night. So we're out of venison. This is August. The season doesn't open until October for bow hunting. So yeah, we're supplementing our diet right now with quite a bit of fish. And when not, well, we've got a neighbor that we're bartering eggs for. Supper doesn't get a whole lot fresher than this. So from the garden and onto the fire in the same day. That's as fresh as it gets. And that old saying, "Waste not, want not." Well, we had some fresh trout last night for supper, and we had some leftovers. So we're going to fry up some fish cakes, which was a pretty common food back in the time period. But talking about food of the 18th century, a couple of people I want to give a shout out to. So one is Justine Dorn, and her site is called Early America. And she's not a meat and potato person. She delves into the real exquisite cuisine of the 18th and 19th century, from recipes that she researches, cooks on an open hearth fire, and does some amazing meals. I wish I could taste one, but and Ronnie Rayfield has a site. He participates with Justine, but he has a site called American Patriot, and it's a fascinating YouTube channel as well. So, if you like history, you're going to love these two people. So I encourage you to check them out. And I got to point out this too. Ronnie sent me that. He gifted me that, and he turned that out. So he's also a pretty skilled craftsman. Anyway, we're going to cook up our fish cakes here, and I'm getting pretty hungry. We've been working on that blacksmith shop today, and I got a bit of a hunger going. So while my meal's cooking there, a wee bit of history, and it's about food security. And history's sort of long forgotten what it was like for the first Europeans that landed on this continent. Um, they were essentially hunter gatherers, and it took them some time before the cultivation of foods, if you would give them that food security they needed. They often relied on ships arriving from Europe, resupply ships, and those ships' arrival, whether they came or not, it meant life or death to them. And we have images, if you would, or paintings of those first Thanksgivings of the in the say Jamestown or Plymouth Rock, with these tables laid out with bountiful amounts of food. Well, it wasn't like that. In fact, like I said, if the ships didn't arrive, and even if they did arrive, those supplies were often depleted very quickly. So they relied on trade with the natives, and often through long, cold winters, they would be down to half rations, sometimes quarter rations, sometimes even less. So it wasn't food security didn't change, and you might say they got off to a pretty rocky start, but the food security changed with indentured servitude. So people were starving in Europe as well, living in the slums and ghettos, and anybody that could get out of that and saw a new future for themselves in the New World would make their way across the ocean. But in order to do that, because they had no money, they would indenture themselves to someone in the New World, someone more affluent, for a 7-year period, usually a 7-year period. And so now, all of a sudden, food growth and agriculture, if you would, develop, because it's a time period when there's no mechanization whatsoever. You've got a hoe, you've got a rake, you've got a scythe, you've got an axe. Everything is done by hand. And I believe it was around 1619 when, and sadly, very sad part of history, when the first ships carrying slaves arrive in the New World. And by the 1700s, there are so many shiploads of slaves arriving, particularly in the southern colonies, that they replace the indentured servitude. And now the people living on the continent have food security because they've got the labor, they've got a source of free labor to produce the foods that they need and grow. So they go from being subsistent, if you would, to being in a position where they can sell, barter, trade surplus items that they have, something that would have been unheard of in the early 1600s. We can easily look at more modern history to show us that there really isn't such a thing as food security. I mean, we take it for granted today because food's so readily available. We just simply go to a store and that supply chain is always there, or we think it'll always be there. But more modern history would indicate that any of the major wars saw a huge food shortage across the world. The current one in Russia and Ukraine, I believe Ukraine is the third largest producer of wheat in the world, is leading to global hunger, particularly in the African countries. So people ask us, why do we grow a garden? Vegetables are cheap in the fall. You can go to the farmer's market and just pick up anything. Well, yeah, you can this year, but will you be able to next year? So it's something we don't take for granted. We grow our food, we hunt for our food, we preserve our food. And it's a good feeling. It's like our filling our wood sheds. We have 3 of them, and filling them with wood is something that it's just a good feeling. When it's full, or they're full, the root cellar's full, we're happy campers. A real classic example of food supply would be the Irish famines, and that's where all my ancestors are from. So some of my people that I'm related to lived through this, but there were numerous potato famines, but the big one leading up to the big one, which was 1847, and they called it Black 47. 2.1 million people left Ireland in about a 5-year window of time. And leading up to about 1851, another 1.2 million had left. Canada takes in about 340,000 of them. But if you can picture yourself on one of these ships, an example is in 47, 106,000 people left Ireland for the British Americas or Canada, and of those 17,000, the statistics would show 17,445 died en route. So if you can imagine being in the hold of a ship that was never designed for people, there weren't berths, there weren't accommodations, they had no light, they had stagnant air, the fevered people laid between the sound people, and most of them were buried at sea without their rites of the church, if you would. And some of the ships leaving from England, they'd modified them somewhat. So the statistics would indicate those leaving Liverpool, England, about 1 in 14 would die on the passage. Those leaving Cork, Ireland, 1 in 9 would die in the passage or shortly after arriving. So when they arrived, the entry point would be Quebec City. And they arrive at Quebec City, they had to go on quarantine on Royal Isle. And once they were cleared of that, they would make their way to Montreal, Toronto, and along the north shore of Lake Ontario, some of the smaller ports like Kingston, Port Hope, Cobourg. They would have what they called fever sheds. And in one in Kingston, I believe they had something like 200 beds, but they had over 2,000 people that were sick with the fever at that point. Anyway, I guess to sum up, we don't think food security can become an issue. Certainly hasn't in my lifetime. I've never gone hungry. My children have never gone hungry. My grandchildren have never gone hungry. But history would show us that it has happened and it can happen, and it is happening. As I mentioned earlier, it's happening right now. And again, I'm a fortunate man because tonight I'm going to be dining on some very fine cuisine. So I got to get my fish cakes frying up here, and I'm darn hungry.